September 15, 1943. Monte Corvino Airfield, Salerno, Italy. The pencil moved quickly across the paper as Oberst Dietrich Peltz, a Luftwaffe staff officer temporarily assigned to Kesselring's headquarters, jotted down notes that would ultimately transform Germany's understanding of American military power. This cannot be right, he thought. The Americans arrived only 6 days ago, and yet I can already see 17 aircraft operating from what, just yesterday, was a field of wheat. Through his binoculars, he had just witnessed something that defied every rule of German military doctrine regarding airfield construction. American C-47 transports were now taking off and landing on a fully functional runway that hadn't even existed 3 days earlier. The steel planking shimmered in the Italian sunlight, spread like a carpet across ground that German engineers had dismissed as unusable for flight operations without months of work. According to Wehrmacht engineering manuals, a proper airfield required at least 6 weeks to construct, under perfect conditions and free from enemy interference. But here, under continuous shelling and air attacks, American engineers had built a working fighter base in less time than it typically took German units to assemble a field command post. Later, 27 German officers captured during the Allied advance would confess their complete astonishment at what they had seen. None of them yet realized that this moment marked the beginning of a quiet revolution, one that would dismantle the entire foundation of German military thought, not through better tactics or bravery, but through engineering that rendered traditional strategy irrelevant. The equation of air superiority was no longer written in aerial victories, but in construction timetables that German planners had deemed physically impossible. The revelation had truly begun 4 days earlier, on September 9, 1943, when Allied forces landed at Salerno. Among the first waves of landing craft came vehicles carrying strange cargo that German observers couldn't immediately identify. General Major Rudolf Sickenius, commander of the 16th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, reported seeing American trucks loaded with what looked like thousands of perforated steel plates, stacked neatly like giant playing cards. His intelligence staff assumed they were meant for temporary roadways, perhaps to stabilize supply routes through Italy's muddy terrain. None of them understood that they were watching the deployment of pierced steel planking, or PSP, an invention that would completely change the nature of modern warfare. The origins of this breakthrough went back to November 1941, at a small, little-known airfield near Marston, North Carolina. There, American engineers had achieved what German planners considered impossible, constructing a 3,000-foot runway capable of supporting heavy bombers in just 11 days. The secret lay in a brilliantly simple design: interlocking steel mats, each 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, weighing 66 pounds and punctured with 87 holes to reduce weight without losing strength. German attachés in Washington had even reported on these tests, but Berlin dismissed their dispatches as typical American propaganda, a boastful attempt to intimidate opponents. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schultz of the Wehrmacht Engineering Corps would later reflect in his post-war study, "We believe the Americans were soft, that their addiction to comfort made them unfit for the hardships of real war. What we failed to see was that this very weakness, their refusal to tolerate discomfort, would push them to build comfort into the battlefield itself." The Germans' first real encounter with this capability came at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, though it would take another year for the High Command to understand its importance. Japanese reports reaching Berlin in late 1942 described how American engineers restored cratered runways in mere hours instead of days. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht dismissed these as excuses from Tokyo, meant to rationalize Japan's failures in the Solomons. General Alfred Jodl reportedly scoffed, saying the Japanese were seeing ghosts to justify their defeats. But those ghosts were real. The 804th Engineer Aviation Battalion had landed with the Marines at Guadalcanal in August 1942, inheriting a half-finished Japanese airstrip. Within days, despite relentless naval bombardment and daily air raids, they turned it into a functioning combat airbase capable of supporting non-stop operations. The Japanese, whose engineering manuals allocated weeks for such construction, watched in disbelief as American bulldozers, operating day and night, accomplished in mere hours what their own laborers required days to complete. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Kleist, captured at Salerno while commanding an artillery unit, spent long hours questioning his American interrogators about these astonishing feats, unable to accept their answers. In letters to his wife, discovered decades later in U.S. archives, he wrote, "They speak of laying airstrips as one might speak of spreading a tablecloth. They had mechanized what once seemed impossible." The true shock for German officers came not just from the speed, but from the sheer magnitude of American production. Every single steel mat demanded precise fabrication to guarantee flawless interlocking performance. Each hook and slot cut into the panels required tolerances tighter than 1/16 of an inch. German factories, though famous for precision, could barely maintain such standards even when producing a few thousand aircraft components per month. By mid-1943, the Americans were turning out over 3 million square feet of PSP matting monthly, enough to build 10 heavy bomber bases. At the Carnegie, Illinois Steel Company alone, 5 production lines operated non-stop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Steel arrived from Pennsylvania mills, was pressed under machines exerting 2,000 tons of force, punched with holes following a design perfected by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and shipped to ports before the paint had even fully dried. Workers later recalled that the heat on the factory floor became so intense that shifts had to rotate every 2 hours to prevent exhaustion. The supply network delivering these materials to the front defied German logic. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, in command of German forces in Italy, later estimated that transporting the materials for a single American airfield required more shipping capacity than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in the Mediterranean. Yet the Americans managed to build dozens of such bases at once, all while maintaining their standard supply lines. Colonel Wilhelm Schmalz, whose Kampfgruppe had fought during the Allied invasion of Sicily, recorded his observations in a report that survived the war in Wehrmacht archives. On July 13, 1943, his reconnaissance patrols witnessed American engineers beginning construction near Gela. Day 1. Americans clear the terrain with armored bulldozers, untouched by sniper fire. Day 2. Ground leveled by machines working through the night, their floodlights blazing without fear of detection. Day 3. Endless convoys of trucks deliver steel matting. Day 4. Fighter planes land. This, Schmalz wrote, was no longer warfare as the Germans understood it. It was industrial domination. The aviation engineers themselves embodied a form of warfare German doctrine had never even imagined. By 1943, over 118,000 U.S. troops were assigned exclusively to airfield construction, organized into specialized battalions equipped with machinery that appeared almost fantastical to German eyes. Each battalion possessed tools worth more than a panzer company. D7 bulldozers capable of moving 20 tons of earth within minutes, graders that leveled terrain faster than 100 men with shovels, and pneumatic drills powerful enough to shatter rock that German pioneers would have needed explosives to clear. Sergeant Klaus Müller, a Wehrmacht engineer captured in Sicily, later testified that one American bulldozer operator accomplished in an hour what his entire company would take a week to complete. Yet, he said, it wasn't only the machinery, it was the precision of their method. Every action followed a procedure, timed and executed with clockwork discipline. While the Germans were still measuring and planning, American aircraft were already landing. The operational history of the 814th Engineer Aviation Battalion, captured intact when their headquarters was briefly overrun near Foggia, exposed the astonishing tempo of U.S. engineering. In just 5 weeks in Sicily, they had built or repaired 13 airfields. They cleared 6,000 landmines without a single loss, using magnetic detection tools unknown to German pioneers. They installed 2.5 million square feet of PSP matting, moved 3 million cubic yards of earth, and built drainage systems that transformed swampland into reliable, all-weather airstrips. German intelligence initially refused to accept these claims. Oberst Hermann Balck, who would later command a panzer division in France, reviewed the captured files and dismissed them as fabrications meant to deceive. He estimated such work would demand at least 10,000 laborers over 6 months. When informed that the American battalion numbered fewer than 800 men, he accused his own intelligence staff of incompetence. The systematic nature of American airfield construction was perhaps the most disturbing revelation for German observers. The process was standardized with near-mechanical precision. Site selection, surveying, clearing, grading, drainage, matting, and facilities all proceeded in a fixed sequence outlined in manuals that reduced complex engineering to simple checklists. One captured American manual, TM 5255 Aviation Engineers, became mandatory reading among German staff officers, who struggled to understand its casual confidence that any flat stretch of ground could become an operational airfield within 72 hours. Lieutenant General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, commanding the 70th Panzer Corps in Italy, observed these operations from his post overlooking the Rapido River Valley. He watched in disbelief as the Americans constructed an entire cluster of airfields below him, continuing their work even under direct observation from German artillery positions on the surrounding heights. In his memoirs, he recalled, "We could destroy their work every night, cratering their runways, blowing up their facilities. Yet by morning, everything was restored before our own pilots had even finished breakfast." It wasn't a fight against an army, he wrote, but against an industrial machine that never stopped running. What unsettled the Germans most was not the initial construction itself, but how fast the Americans could repair the damage. Even successful bombing raids brought only brief results. Luftwaffe engineers had calculated that a 500-kilogram bomb, leaving a crater 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep, should render a runway unusable for at least 48 hours, even with continuous repairs. American engineers, however, usually had such damage fixed and the strip operational again within 4 to 6 hours. Their advantage lay not only in technology, but in planning. Aviation engineer battalions carried large reserves of PSP matting specifically for emergency use. They had pre-positioned gravel, sand, and rapid-setting concrete at key points around every airfield, and they kept bulldozers and graders ready at all times. Most impressively, they had standardized their repair methods so thoroughly that crews could perform the entire process at night, by memory alone, continuing operations even under German bombing. Master Sergeant Antonio Benedetti of the 825th Engineer Aviation Battalion described the process in a letter home later printed in stars and stripes. "Jerry drops his eggs at 2300 hours. By 2315, we're rolling. The dozers shove debris aside, the graders smooth the edges, trucks dump fill, compactors flatten it, and by midnight, we're laying mat. By 0200, the PSP is bolted down and painted. By sunrise, our fighters are flying off the same spot Jerry just hit. It's like a choreographed dance," he wrote. "Everyone knows their steps." The German Air Force, already suffering from fuel shortages and the loss of trained pilots, now faced an impossible situation. Every airfield they struck was repaired and active again before they could plan the next raid. Meanwhile, new American airfields appeared so rapidly that Luftwaffe intelligence couldn't keep pace. A planning document from October 1943 listed 17 Allied fields in the Foggia area. By the time the briefings reached German pilots, 24 were operational and 7 more under construction. The scale and precision of American airfield construction seemed unbelievable to German engineers bound by traditional methods. A standard fighter runway required 5,000 feet of length, 150 feet of width, and had to withstand aircraft weighing 30,000 pounds landing at 90 miles per hour. German doctrine, built around concrete, assumed at least 6 weeks for such a project, even under ideal conditions. The Americans completed these airstrips routinely in less than 72 hours, often under fire and direct observation. General der Panzertruppe Joachim Lemmelsen, who faced American air power in Italy, reported to the OKW, "The enemy's air superiority is not merely a matter of aircraft numbers or pilot skill, though both are impressive. It is a matter of omnipresence. Wherever we mass troops, an American airfield materializes within days. We cannot stop their progress. They build faster than we can strike." German intelligence officers became fascinated by the structure of these aviation engineer battalions when interrogating captured personnel. They discovered that these units contained not just soldiers but skilled professionals from across American society. Civil engineers from highway departments, equipment operators from mining companies, concrete experts from dam projects, and even drainage specialists from the Department of Agriculture. One battalion commander had overseen construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. Another had directed highway building in the Rocky Mountains. This vast expertise was combined with machines that seemed almost otherworldly to German eyes accustomed to hand labor. The Caterpillar D7 bulldozer, the cornerstone of U.S. airfield work, could pull 20,000 pounds, shifting boulders that German engineers would have needed explosives to move. The Northwest 80D crane could position entire prefabricated buildings with ease. The Quickway crane unloaded a full truck of PSP matting in 3 minutes, a task that would have kept a German pioneer unit occupied for an hour. Major Wilhelm Dürr, a Luftwaffe base commander captured in southern France, spent weeks studying American engineering methods as a prisoner. In his post-war analysis for the United States Air Force Historical Studies, he wrote, "We operated from concrete runways built by the Todd organization over months or even years, or from grass fields that had existed for generations. The Americans, by contrast, carried their runways with them, like carpenters carrying their tools. It was not something we could ever have replicated. It demanded an entire industrial mindset that we lacked. This ability to build airfields overnight changed the nature of warfare in ways the Germans never truly adapted to. American commanders could now establish forward fighter bases within a single night, providing air cover and close support at ranges once considered impossible. They could shift entire concentrations of air power along the front in a matter of days instead of weeks. Most devastating of all, the Americans could afford to build airfields they might never even use, creating uncertainty that forced German commanders to scatter their already limited resources. During Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in August 1944, American engineers surpassed even their earlier accomplishments. The 852nd Engineer Aviation Battalion landed with the initial assault waves and had an emergency strip operational by D+1. By D+3, 2 American fighter squadrons were already operating from French soil. By D+7, they had completed 3 separate airfields, each capable of handling medium bombers. German commanders, who had counted on at least 2 weeks before facing major Allied air activity, found themselves under constant bombardment from the second day of the invasion onward. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group G in southern France, reported to the OKW, "The enemy's tactical air power increases daily. Each morning brings new reconnaissance reports of additional airfields. Our movements, limited to the night, extend only a few kilometers before dawn exposes us to fighters operating from bases that did not exist the night before." The cultural shock went far beyond technical astonishment. German military tradition prized permanence, precision, and thorough preparation. Luftwaffe air bases were built with 2-foot-thick concrete runways, complex drainage systems, fortified hangars, and vast maintenance facilities. Each installation represented millions of Reichsmarks and countless hours of labor, making them strategic assets to be guarded at all costs. The American philosophy, temporary, mobile, and almost expendable, was a conceptual revolution that German thinking could not process. Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, the renowned Stuka pilot, observed American operations firsthand while stationed briefly in Italy before the German withdrawal. He later wrote, "We spent 2 years constructing our base at Foggia. The Americans rebuilt it in 2 weeks after destroying it, but they rebuilt it in their own way, not permanent, not solid, not traditional. They laid down steel strips that could be pulled up and moved at will. They raised tent hangars that could vanish in hours. They created power without permanence. It was war without weight." The psychological effect on German troops was as significant as the tactical shift. Soldiers crouched in foxholes watched American fighters take off from runways built where they had fought just days earlier. Tank crews saw their carefully hidden positions exposed by reconnaissance planes flying from airstrips that hadn't existed when they dug in. Artillery observers discovered their targets protected by fighters scrambled from fields assembled overnight. Gefreiter Johann Schmidt, whose letters home survived, wrote in November 1943, "The Americans are not fighting a war. They are building a civilization. Wherever they advance, airfields rise, roads are paved, telephone lines appear. We destroy. They build. We abandon positions held for months, and they build airfields on the ground we left yesterday. How can we defeat an enemy who carries his own geography with him?" The innovation extended well beyond PSP matting. American engineers had machinery for every possible task. The Rome plow, a massive blade built for clearing vegetation, could uproot trees 18 inches thick while moving at 5 miles per hour. Specialized drilling rigs bored drainage wells through solid stone. Portable rock crushers transformed debris from bombed structures into base material for new runways. Chemical soil stabilizers could turn loose sand into surfaces strong enough for heavy bombers. German engineers, many of them trained professionals before the war, were reduced to hand tools while watching young American soldiers operate machines that reshaped landscapes. A captured report from the 19th Luftwaffe Field Division expressed astonishment that American boy soldiers, some barely 18, casually handled equipment worth more than entire German engineering units owned. The prefabrication revolution left German observers speechless. Entire airfield complexes arrived packed in numbered crates, ready for instant assembly like colossal construction kits. Control towers 40 feet high could be erected in 8 hours. Hangars covering 15,000 square feet became operational within 48 hours. Fuel systems with underground storage tanks and extensive pipelines were ready in 72 hours. Operations centers, complete with radio and communications gear, were functioning within a single day of arrival. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Zimmermann, a Luftwaffe logistics officer, calculated that comparable German facilities would require 2,000 tons of concrete, 500 tons of steel reinforcement, 50,000 hours of skilled labor, and a minimum of 8 weeks under perfect conditions. He watched the Americans achieve greater results using just 100 tons of prefabricated materials, 50 men, and 72 hours. The logistics chain that supported this miracle of construction defied every German understanding of how warfare could be supplied. Each aviation engineer battalion required roughly 2,000 tons of equipment and material to construct a single fighter airfield. A bomber base needed around 5,000 tons. Yet American Liberty ships, themselves symbols of revolutionary mass production, delivered these immense quantities directly to invasion beaches, where landing craft designed specifically for PSP transport carried them ashore. Within mere hours of landing, steel matting was already moving inland on trucks built in Detroit, running on fuel refined in Texas, and guided by maps printed in Washington. General der Infanterie Gustav von Zangen, whose 15th Army confronted American forces in Holland, recalled watching American C-47s landing on what his staff insisted was an empty field. My operations officer swore the grid reference was wrong. There was no airfield there. I had to hand him my binoculars. The Americans had built it while we were still writing reports about defending the position. The strategic implications slowly dawned on German leadership, though by then it was far too late to develop any effective counter-strategy. The American capacity to project air power instantly, anywhere, rendered the very concept of fixed front lines meaningless. Every German position, regardless of distance from Allied bases, was now within immediate reach of air attack. Reserve movements became impossible without triggering strikes from fighters taking off from runways that hadn't even existed when orders were issued. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding forces in the West, issued a desperate directive in May 1944. Enemy airfield construction capacity must be considered unlimited. All plans must assume Allied tactical air support will be operational within 72 hours of any landing or breakthrough. Traditional estimates of distance from enemy bases are obsolete. The order proved prophetic. Following D-Day, American engineers achieved feats even more astonishing. New airstrips appeared across Normandy, like mushrooms after rain. ALGA-1, near Sainte-Mère-Église, became operational on Dplows 3. By D+10, 9 American airfields were active in Normandy. By D+30, the number had risen to 24. German forces now endured relentless air attacks from planes based so close that pilots could complete 4 or 5 missions a day, refueling and rearming within minutes. Captain Hermann Buchner, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer who analyzed American engineering performance, later wrote in his post-war report preserved in U.S. archives, "We were not defeated by American bravery, though they were brave. We were not defeated by their weapons, though they were excellent. We were defeated by their engineers, who made geography meaningless. They built their victory, runway by runway, across Europe." The height of American airfield construction efficiency came during the Rhine crossing in March 1945. The 834th Engineer Aviation Battalion crossed the river at Remagen and completed an emergency landing strip on the eastern bank within 18 hours. By the second day, C-47s were already landing supplies directly onto the bridgehead. German commanders, who had assumed it would take days before Allied air support could reach the crossing, suddenly found their defenses collapsing within hours. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, leading the Panzer Lehr Division, reported bitterly to his superiors, "The Americans bring their air force with them, as if it were artillery. Where they arrive in the morning, their planes fly by evening. We cannot move, cannot regroup, cannot resist effectively. They have industrialized war beyond our comprehension." The numbers alone told a story no German courage or tactical skill could offset. By the war's end, U.S. aviation engineer battalions had built or rebuilt more than 1,000 airfields across Europe and the Pacific. They had laid over 300 million square feet of PSP matting, enough to pave a runway stretching from Berlin to Moscow. They had shifted 500 million cubic yards of earth, leveled 50 million square yards of ground, and installed over 1,000 miles of drainage pipe. What German planners believed would take decades, the Americans achieved in mere months. Werner Kreipe, Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe, summarized the reality from captivity. "We prepared for a war of armies and valor, of courage and sacrifice. The Americans fought a war of production and engineering, of logistics and efficiency. We believed war was an art. They proved it was an industry. Every downed American aircraft was replaced the next day. Every bomb-cratered runway was operational by dawn. We could destroy, but they could create. And creation proved stronger than destruction." Wehrmacht veterans, interviewed long after the war, consistently identified American engineering as the most psychologically devastating factor in fighting the Western Allies. Combat, they understood. That had always been the German way. But this industrialized reinvention of warfare left them intellectually and emotionally defenseless. They could grasp being outfought. What they could never comprehend was being outbuilt. Feldwebel Karl Heinz, a veteran of both the Eastern and Western fronts, explained the contrast in a 1975 interview. "Against the Russians, we fought battles. Against the Americans, we fought factories. When we destroyed a Russian position, it stayed destroyed until reinforcements arrived. When we destroyed an American one, it was rebuilt before we could reload our guns. The Russians had courage and numbers. The Americans had bulldozers and steel matting. I feared the bulldozers more." The portable airfield system reached its peak during Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. American engineers parachuted alongside the airborne troops, carrying lightweight aluminum planking created specifically for rapid runway assembly during airborne operations. Within 6 hours of landing, they had laid out landing zones for gliders bringing in additional supplies. Within 12 hours, an operational airstrip was functioning, ready to evacuate wounded and deliver reinforcements. German commanders witnessing this realized that the Americans had achieved the ultimate form of battlefield flexibility. They could establish air dominance anywhere instantly, regardless of opposition or terrain. General der Fallschirmjäger Hermann Bernhard Ramke, Germany's most seasoned paratroop commander, observed their work and later admitted, "We invented airborne warfare, but the Americans perfected it. We could seize airfields, they could build them. We could take objectives, they could create entire bases. They had industrialized even the elite art of airborne combat. The difference between the two systems became ever more apparent as the war dragged on. The Luftwaffe's construction units, the Luftwaffe Bautruppen, still operated with methods that had barely changed since the First World War. They depended heavily on manual labor, often relying on prisoners of war and forced workers. A typical German airfield project in 1944 required 5,000 laborers working 3 months to complete what an American aviation engineer battalion could achieve with 800 men in only 3 days. General Major Walter Grabmann, commander of the 3rd Fighter Division, recalled inspecting a captured American airfield in France. Everything was temporary, yet perfectly functional. The control tower was prefabricated wood, easy to dismantle, but it contained better equipment than our permanent facilities. The hangars were made of canvas and steel frames, resembling circus tents, yet they offered better protection because they could be repaired or replaced within hours. It was, as he put it, the architecture of victory, strength without permanence, capability without commitment. The cultural contrast extended far beyond technical methods. German military tradition revered durability and grandeur, engineering monuments built to last for generations. The Luftwaffe's pre-war bases were almost architectural statements, complete with Art Deco terminals and massive concrete hangars. American airfields, on the other hand, were purely functional, designed to last only as long as necessary, not a day longer. This difference reflected the deeper philosophical divide in how each nation approached warfare. Professor Heinrich Foch, designer of the Focke-Wulf aircraft, toured several American-built airfields after his capture and wrote, "German engineering seeks perfection, the flawless solution meant to endure forever. American engineering seeks adequacy, the fastest solution that works today. In peace, ours might be better. In war, theirs was devastating. While we calculated load stress, they were already landing aircraft." The sheer speed of American construction created tactical possibilities that German doctrine had never foreseen and could not counter. During the Normandy breakout, U.S. commanders were able to call for air support from fields that did not yet exist when the order was issued but were completed before the attack began. Patton's Third Army, in its dash across France, was supported by airfields advancing almost as quickly as the front line itself, maintaining close air support at ranges that should have been beyond reach. Colonel Hermann Zimmermann, operations officer for Luftflotte 3, wrote in August 1944, "American fighter bombers operate freely, seemingly without range limits. Our intelligence reports, based on known airfield locations, are useless. They build new fields faster than we can update our maps. We are fighting an enemy who reshapes geography to his needs." The Americans' repair ability proved just as decisive as their speed of construction. During the Battle of the Bulge, German generals expected winter weather to ground Allied aircraft and allow their offensive to proceed unhindered. What they failed to anticipate was that American engineers could clear snow from PSP runways in minutes using specialized equipment, while German concrete airfields remained unusable for days. This capacity to sustain air operations in weather that immobilized the Luftwaffe gave the Allies a crucial advantage. The psychological toll on German pilots was immense. Unlike attacks on fixed airfields, where damage accumulated over time, assaults on American bases felt futile. Young Luftwaffe airmen, already hopelessly outnumbered, began to lose faith in missions that achieved nothing lasting. Veterans later recalled that morale in many Luftwaffe squadrons collapsed when reconnaissance reports revealed that airfields they had just bombed were already operational again within hours. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, a Messerschmitt 262 pilot and one of Germany's last hopes for regaining air superiority, described his experience with bitter clarity. "Our jets gave us speed, the one advantage that should have made a difference. But speed meant nothing when the enemy had airfields everywhere. We could outrun their fighters, but not their geography. Every landing ground we might have used was gone or captured, and everyone they needed appeared overnight." The production figures behind American airfield construction defied German comprehension of what industrial power could achieve. The United States manufactured enough PSP matting to cover more than 200 square miles, using steel that Germany desperately needed for tanks, submarines, and weapons. The process required precision engineering and strict quality control that German factories, crippled by bombings and shortages, could no longer sustain. Yet the Americans produced PSP alongside record numbers of planes, ships, vehicles, and every other instrument of war. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, at first dismissed captured U.S. production statistics as propaganda. When post-war investigations proved their accuracy, he confessed, "We could not imagine such industrial strength. It surpassed not only our capacity, but our imagination itself." The Americans were not merely fighting another war. They were fighting from another century. The legacy of American airfield engineering lingered long after the war ended. During NATO planning sessions in the 1950s, former Wehrmacht officers repeatedly interrupted discussions of Soviet threats to ask about Allied airfield construction capabilities, still haunted by the memory of American engineering overwhelming every calculation. General Franz Halder, former chief of the General Staff, wrote in his memoirs, "We prepared for every contingency except one, that the enemy would simply build his way to victory." The Americans treated Europe like a construction site and had the machinery to reshape it as they wished. Our finest tactical minds were defeated not by generals, but by bulldozers and prefabricated steel. The transformation represented by American aviation engineers went far beyond technical innovation. It symbolized a mindset that regarded every traditional limitation as an engineering challenge to be solved rather than a barrier to accept. Mountains, rivers, swamps, and distances, the obstacles that had shaped European strategy for centuries, became mere inconveniences to be bulldozed, bridged, drained, or ignored entirely. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, reflecting on the Italian campaign, offered perhaps the most concise expression of German disbelief. "We were the heirs of Clausewitz and Moltke, masters of operational art, students of 2,000 years of warfare. We knew how to fight in every terrain, under every condition, against every opponent. But the Americans did not fight terrain. They changed it. They did not accept conditions. They remade them. They did not win through battle. They constructed their victory, runway by runway, until our skill meant nothing and our experience counted for less." The final humiliation came after the war, when German officers were compelled to attend U.S. Army engineering demonstrations. They watched aviation engineer battalions assemble full-scale airfields during exercises, completing in a few hours what German doctrine said would take weeks. Veterans later described leaving those displays in tears, finally understanding the magnitude of their misjudgment. Colonel Joachim Muncheberg, a fighter ace with 135 victories, witnessed one such demonstration in 1946. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "Today, I saw American engineers build in 4 hours what we could not complete in 4 weeks. Now I understand why we lost. We brought soldiers to an industrial contest. We believed courage and skill would triumph over material superiority, but they made that superiority so absolute that our courage ceased to matter." The statistics served as a final epitaph for German military pride. American aviation engineers built 235 major airfields across Europe alone, not counting hundreds of temporary and emergency strips. They laid enough PSP to pave a road from London to Istanbul, and moved enough earth to fill a canal stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They achieved rates of construction that German engineers, even with forced labor, could never approach. In the Pacific, the achievements were even more astonishing. Engineers turned coral atolls into vast air bases, cut runways through jungles that German analysts had deemed impossible, and built installations on islands that pre-war strategists had considered useless. The culmination came on Tinian in 1944, where American engineers built the largest airfield in the world, 6 runways, each more than 8,000 feet long. From those strips, B-29s would take off to deliver the atomic bombs that ended the war. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, Germany's senior naval engineer, studied American construction techniques while interned after the war. His conclusion was simple and unflinching. We had always measured military strength in divisions, ships, and aircraft. The Americans measured theirs in tons of concrete poured, miles of runway laid, and cubic yards of earth moved. We were right in believing that modern wars would be won by industrial might, yet we never conceived that such power could be projected straight onto the battlefield, that factories themselves could become weapons as potent as artillery. The revolution in military engineering embodied by American aviation engineers fundamentally altered the nature of war. Their ability to generate air superiority anywhere, instantly through construction rather than combat, made traditional military geography obsolete. Distance from bases, terrain challenges, and seasonal conditions, once decisive elements in every campaign, became mere details in American operational planning. General Heinz Guderian, architect of Germany's armored warfare doctrine, summarized the shock to German military thought with rare candor. We perfected mobile warfare, the blitzkrieg that conquered Europe. But the Americans achieved something greater: mobile infrastructure. They didn't merely move armies swiftly, they moved civilization itself. They brought their factories to the front, assembled them under fire, and made them function in battle. We were still fighting the last war while they were creating the next one. The story of Germany's encounter with American airfield construction is ultimately a tale of conceptual defeat. The Wehrmacht, proud heir to centuries of European military tradition, faced an opponent who had transcended that tradition entirely. American aviation engineers didn't just defeat German strategy, they rendered it irrelevant. They proved that in the modern age, the power to build outweighed the power to destroy, that creation could overcome devastation, that engineering could triumph where tactics failed. SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, one of Germany's most decorated field commanders, offered perhaps the most haunting epitaph for German assumptions during an interrogation after the war. "You Americans kept saying you'd win because you could outproduce us. We laughed, thinking you meant tanks and planes. We never realized you meant you would produce the battlefield itself, that you would manufacture the very ground we fought on. You didn't defeat the Wehrmacht, you bypassed it, building victory on airstrips that didn't exist when the battle began." The German generals, men who had memorized Napoleon's campaigns, who could quote Clausewitz and debate Schlieffen's theories, found themselves undone by American teenagers driving bulldozers and laying steel mats. They had prepared for every conceivable form of warfare, except the one that awaited them: industrial construction at combat tempo, engineering as a weapon, building as a form of fighting. In the end, Germany's military elite faced a truth they could hardly bear. They had not been outfought. They had been outbuilt. The finest army in Europe, perhaps in history, was defeated not by superior strategy or heroism, but by an adversary who could turn wheat fields into air bases overnight, repair in hours what took days to destroy, and wage war not only with courage, but with bulldozers and steel. Generalfeldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, upon signing Germany's surrender, is said to have told General Eisenhower, "We expected to face American industry. We did not expect to face it directly on the battlefield, in the form of engineers who could build faster than we could destroy." Eisenhower's response, if accurately recorded, was simple and devastating: "That's why you lost." The legacy of that revelation still defines modern warfare. Today, rapid airfield construction, forward engineering, and expeditionary logistics are assumed to be essential components of military power. What once astonished German commanders in 1943 has become so commonplace that no modern officer can imagine war without it. Yet for the Wehrmacht officers who first saw American engineers unrolling steel runways from the backs of trucks, it marked the end of their world and the birth of a new one. They had expected to fight soldiers. They had not expected to fight an industrial system capable of erasing and recreating the battlefield itself. They could never have imagined that their enemy's greatest weapon would not be a tank, a plane, or a gun, but the capacity to transform any patch of earth into a functioning airbase, instantly and endlessly. The German generals never dreamed Americans would unroll airstrips overnight. They were wrong. That single misjudgment, more than any lost battle or failed campaign, explains why the Wehrmacht, masters of continental warfare, were powerless before an adversary who had industrialized victory itself. In the end, Germany brought an army to an engineering contest and lost before it even understood the nature of the fight.